Thank you all for participating this evening. We're so happy and excited to be able to bring you tonight's program with Bill Lindeke. But before we get to the introduction, I'm going to turn it over to Clarence White from the East Side Freedom Library to say a couple words.
Thank you, Robin. Welcome, everyone. I'm glad to see so many people interested in this great event. The East Side Freedom Library has a lot of events going on, and we're just pleased to have the Ramsey County Historical Society as one of our partners. And they have done a wonderful job in curating the series and allowing us to join in this great effort. The Eastside Freedom Library has a website, eastsidefreedomlibrary.org. You can check out our events there, many of which we will be doing along with the Historical Society. And there's so many things and so many stories, so many perspectives that we get to share. And we have the privilege of hearing those stories. And if you want to do the same thing, we hope you'll join us with that. We are a collection of artists, scholars, community folks, and intergenerational. And if you want to know what our community is about, what Ramsey County really is, come and listen to our friends, our collaborators, our partners. And with that, I'll hand it back over to Robin. Thanks, Robin.
Thank you, Clarence. I'm Robin with the Ramsey County Historical Society. And I want to thank the Eastside Freedom Library and the Roseville Library. Judy Woodward is here tonight from the Roseville Library for all their support and partnership for the History Revealed series, which we're going on for nearly 5 years now, which is astonishing. Please consider supporting the Ramsey County Historical Society. We rely on the support of members and friends like you to continue to present these programs and all of our efforts. And there are some great benefits to joining, including our quarterly magazine, Ramsey County History. And you can find out more about RCHS on our website, www.rchs.com, including our upcoming programs, how to join or donate, membership benefits, our research center, our exhibitions, and much more. And please check out, as Clarence said, the Eastside Freedom Library and the Roseville Library. They both have great programs and appreciate everyone's support. On Thursday, November 18th at 7 o'clock, we have another very special History Revealed with well-known author and art historian Julie L'Enfant, who will be sharing her new book, The Spirit Tree, Hazel Belvo and the Art of Nature. Plus, it's not on our website yet, but I just confirmed with Larry Millette, he will be doing a program on November 11th that will be up on our website soon. So please check that out. He's going to talk about lost Twin Cities mansions. Both of these programs will be online and Zoom registration just like tonight. And that will be available up on our website soon, as I mentioned. So as a reminder, please keep your microphones and personal cameras turned off during the program. You can type your questions and comments in the chat. Clarence and I will be monitoring that and we'll be reading those out loud for Bill to answer later. The program is being recorded and will be up on our YouTube channels, both ours and Eastside Freedom Libraries, shortly. The Ramsey County Historical Society would like to acknowledge this sacred Dakota land. Minnesota Makoche, the land where the waters are so clear they reflect the clouds, is the ancestral and contemporary homeland of the Dakota people. It is also home to the Anishinaabe and other indigenous peoples. The Ramsey County Historical Society acknowledges that its sites are located on and benefit from these sacred Dakota lands. RCHS is committed to preserving our past, informing our present, and inspiring our future. Part of doing so is acknowledging the painful history and current challenges facing the Dakota people, just as we celebrate their contributions and that of other indigenous peoples. You can find our full land acknowledgement statement on our website, which includes actionable ways in which Ramsey County Historical Society pledges to honor the Dakota and other indigenous peoples of Minnesota Makoche. We are committed to presenting the stories and histories of all in our community, and I'm so happy to bring you tonight's program, Urban Biography by Bill Lindeke. I'll be putting a note in the chat with our partner Subtext Books, and you can go to their website and either order the book or pick it up in person. They are in downtown St. Paul, about a block and a half away from the Landmark Center off of Rice Park. So again, thank you to Bill Lindeke for the program tonight. Bill is an urban geographer and writer who focuses on how our environments shape our lives. He wrote MinPost Cityscapes column from 2014 to 2017, has written articles on local food and drink history for City Pages and The Growler, and has taught urban geography at the University of Minnesota and Metro State University. He writes a local urban blog at Twin Cities Sidewalks. And Bill, if you want to put the links to these in the chat, that would be great. And is a member of the St. Paul Planning Commission. He's the author of Minneapolis, St. Paul, Then and Now, which is another great book, and co-author of Closing Time, Saloons, Taverns, Dives, and Watering Holes of the Twin Cities. And we had a presentation about that book previously. As I mentioned, Bill has done several programs with us, and he's always an entertaining and informative presenter. So he'll be back with us on January 21st, 2022 at 7 p.m. on Zoom for our Making Minnesota series, which will focus on the stories of immigrant communities, Indigenous people, and the African Americans who have shaped the history of our county in partnership with our ongoing partners. So I'm going to turn it over to Bill. Thank you, Bill.
Thanks, Robin. Great. That was a lovely introduction. I'm still writing the Cityscape column at MinPost, so and I'm no longer on the Planning Commission. I had 9 years on there, which is the maximum, thankfully, that anyone can do. So I'm off of that now. I'll share my screen now. So I've got a little presentation here about my book. Can you see that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
It's
great.
coming out great. Thank you.
Okay, super. And yeah, well, I'll just dive in. There's a lot to cover. I don't even know if I'll get through all of this. I'll do my best. But I just wanted to thank Ramsey County Historical Society and Roseville Library and the Eastside Freedom Library for having me. This is, I think, my third time with Ramsey County Historical Society talking about books. So it's pretty cool to have, the other times the first time was in person anyway, and that was a lot of fun, but this is really cool too. So yeah, I'll just talk a little bit about my book. It's part of the Historical Society has an Urban Biography series they've started, which I think is really cool. The idea that the editors pitched to me was that these books are supposed to be sort of short, like you pick it up when you move to St. Paul or when you're visiting St. Paul and want to learn more about St. Paul. And it's like a just easy read, short overview of the city history. And the previous versions of this book were, there's one about Duluth, and then there's one about Minneapolis that Tom Weber wrote. And then this is the third in the series. So that's the basic idea of it, is that it's meant to be just a general overview of St. Paul history. And there really aren't a lot of great ones. So I don't know, I read all this books about St. Paul. Part of the challenge of this was that I worked on this throughout 2020, and I had intended originally to spend a lot of time at this Historical Society, Minnesota Historical Society Library. That was my plan for the summer of 2020. It didn't work out because the pandemic came and the libraries were closed, all of them. So I was sort of forced to rely on the graces of my editor, who dropped off a giant cardboard box full of books about St. Paul that she had. Anne Regan is her name. She's the senior editor at the Historical Society Press. And so I read all those during the pandemic. And thankfully, a few of the libraries, the Eastside Freedom Library and Peter Ratcliffe, let me in. So I was able to go through their archive and read a couple books that I couldn't find anywhere else during the pandemic. And, we're talking about May, June 2020 here. So it was a different vibe back then, and people were very nervous about all that. So today, anyway, that's what I did during the pandemic, was research this book and write this book, and I was really excited. The other thing I was able to access online was the Ramsey County Historical Society magazine, which is wonderful. And all of you should join the Historical Society if you're not already and get the magazine. And there's also like decades of archives of amazing research that you can also see and read about. So I drew on the people that are hosting this event today to write the book pretty heavily. Anyway, today, hopefully, we're already behind schedule. I'll have to talk fast. We're going to go through these 4 chapters, the first 4 chapters of the book, naming, dispossession, boomtown, and overshadowed, and maybe get into the wheeling and dealing. And Robin mentioned that I'll be doing another talk later where we can get into some of the other stuff. Part of the problem of writing a St. Paul biography is that you are immediately defined by this term St. Paul as like what you're writing about. So that is a problem because Dakota people who've lived here for thousands of years did not call it St. Paul. Years ago, I went on a trip to Winnipeg, Manitoba, and I was checking into a hotel downtown, and the concierge said, I asked him, so where do you go? What's fun to do in Winnipeg? And he said, go down to the river. There's thousands of years of history at the river down by the forks, they call it. And I was like, wow, thousands of years of history. That's a very interesting way to frame the story of your city. And it was interesting to me because in St. Paul, we rarely say things like that here. We talk about white settler European history, but we almost never talk about Dakota history as part of the story of St. Paul. And it makes sense in some ways because of the history of the Dakota settler colonial conflict and violence that happened here. But the oldest thing, when I was trying to figure out how to write this book, I started with the oldest thing in St. Paul, which is the Indian burial mounds up on Mounds Park Bluff. This is an old picture of them. And basically the problem is that if you want to write a book about St. Paul, you have to cope with the fact that there is a whole different society and culture here that got forcibly removed from this place. And so that was a challenge. That's something that the Historical Society Press has been working on lately. And we as a culture need to be working on because the village of Kaposia was the original people that lived in St. Paul, and Kaposia was right down by the Indian mounds at the bluff, at the base of the bluff. So anyway, having to deal with this was a difficult way to frame the story because St. Paul is sort of antithetical to the idea of thousands of years of Dakota history. And I think that that's reflected in the way that we narrate ourselves as a society here in Minnesota, the state seal, which I find just a bit, I think it needs to be changed. But this is the story of Minnesota, which is to remove Native American people and replace them with white people. And that's what St. Paul really is. So that's how I start the book, by talking a little bit about this. But the way I really started it, and it's an idea that I got from Peter Ratcliffe at the Eastside Freedom Library, was to talk about the St. Paul City Hall murals. So I don't know if any of you have been to St. Paul City Council chambers, or if you prefer Ramsey County Commission chambers, but that's the murals that are on both sides, or used to be on both sides of the chambers where the meetings are held. And you can see they're very tall, they're beautiful. They're from 1932 when the City Hall was built by a muralist named John Norton. And in each case, it's a giant white guy towering over like historical figures that are below his feet. And they're meant to depict different eras of history, but it literally pushes the people of color to the margins of the depiction of history. And so that's how I start the book, by talking a little bit about those images and why. So you see in this photograph, there's a couple African Americans that are in the murals. One of them is a porter, and that's actually a very accurate representation. Also, the woman that's in this train photograph here, train mural here, is the only female person in the murals. So this was just really to interrogate the way that we tell the story of St. Paul and to say, hey, maybe we should reposition things a little bit. And my book attempts to do that. It's really hard to actually tell the story while centering people that are normally at the margins. Because I don't feel like I am the person to talk about Dakota history and its relationship to white settlement. But also, there's not a lot of sources of information for marginalized people. And so I did my best, and I tried to do that in the book. But anyway, I still talk about James J. Hill quite a bit. And so that's what happened. Anyway, this is sort of an image of how I start the conversation about St. Paul history and what it should mean and what it should reflect. And for those of you who don't live in St. Paul, I think there's a few that are on this chat. The murals got changed about a year or two ago after a community conversation, and they now reflect a more diverse series of stories and symbols of who lives in St. Paul and what the history of St. Paul really is. And this is another example of that too. So Mounds Park, which was the park that is up here where the thousands of year old Indian burial mounds are on the top of the bluff, that is like one of the oldest things in St. Paul. Now the sign on it says this is a cemetery, which is a symbolic shift that I think is important to do. But anyway, the history of St. Paul sort of begins with white people arriving and starting to document Dakota people and think about colonizing this part of the Mississippi River. And one of the first people to do that was a guy named Jonathan Carver, who arrives, what year? I didn't write it down. The early 1800s, or no, the late 1700s, I think, something like that, maybe 1800. He's a British guy who comes to, he's living in the United States, and he travels the North Upper Mississippi Valley area, and he becomes sort of famous for writing a tell-all book about what he discovered there. And this is important because it has the first description of what would become St. Paul, the Dakota people that lived here, especially this cave that's located at the base of the Indian Mounds bluff. So like down by the river underneath this bluff is a cave that he then names after himself, Carver's Cave, but the Dakota name for it is Wakantipi, and he describes what it looks like. And he writes in his journal that gets published, 20 feet from the entrance begins a lake, the water of which is transparent and extends to an unsearchable distance, for the darkness of the cave prevents all attempts to acquire a knowledge of it. I threw a small pebble towards the interior with my utmost strength. I could hear it fall into the water. And notwithstanding it was so small a size, it caused an astonishing and horrible noise that reverberated through all the gloomy regions. Anyway, Jonathan Carver, like most Europeans that were traveling through Minnesota, really dramatized the sort of difference between Dakota people and native indigenous people and European people. And this is an example of that. But he does at the end say, he describes the Dakota people here, a little distance from this dreary cavern is the burying place of several bands of Indians, though these people have no fixed residence, living in tents and abiding but a few months on one spot. They always bring the bones of their dead to this place, describing the mounds on top of the bluff in St. Paul. And then he says also that the country around them is extremely beautiful, composed of many gentle ascents, which in the summer are covered with the finest verdure and interspersed with little groves that give a pleasing variety to the prospect. So that is the original description of white people of what would become Carver's Cave, but what actually is called Wakantipi, or in Dakota, it means a dwelling place of the spirit. In this case, I think it's a water spirit or just any spirit. And the cave becomes sort of a tourist attraction in early St. Paul history. This is what it used to look like. It had a big pool inside and had a big roof, and this was a sacred place for the Dakota people, and it still is. And I guess I don't have time to talk about that photograph, but I did go to Wakantipi on a journalism expedition one time, probably 15 years ago, and that's what it looks like today. The cave was obliterated by the railroads. But I think any story of St. Paul should start with framing it as Dakota land and the sacred ancestral home of Dakota people, And that's still true today. And so it's hard to erase that. But it's also hard to reconcile that history with like telling the story of St. Paul, which even the name St. Paul is already framing the issue as a sort of settled Christian manifest destiny type place. But how does St. Paul acquire the name? So that's the first chapter that I dive into, is like telling the story of St. Paul becoming St. Paul. And that all happens through Fort Snelling. So Pike arrives in what would be the confluence of the Minnesota and Mississippi rivers, and sort of signs a treaty with Dakota leaders and agrees to build a fort there. At which point 15 years go by, and they finally get around to building the fort in like about 1817. This is sort of made complicated by the fact that at the same time up in Canada on the Canadian border, there's a colony that was set up in 1811. The King of England, or Queen, I don't know, whoever's in charge in England, grants this large swath of land to this Lord Selkirk, who's this Scottish aristocrat, who then really wants to settle and start a colony there in the middle of the Canadian prairie, which at the time is the end of the earth for European British people. But somehow Selkirk manages to convince enough pilgrims to go and start a colony up on the Canadian-US border in this area. And it doesn't really go very well. Like the first 5 or 10 years, there is bison overhunting, so they kind of run out of food. There's prairie fires, so they can't grow anything. There's floods. There's outbreaks of disease. There's fur trade rivalry. So like the fur traders that are already in this part of Canada don't really like these settlers coming in and trying to farm. And they have their conflicts. And so a lot of the people that originally came to join the Selkirk colony start to leave. And the only place they can go at this point in the 1820s is the fort down at the confluence of the Mississippi and Minnesota rivers. And so some of the Canadians start coming down to what would become St. Paul. They end up living around the edges of Fort Snelling, and sort of just making their best. And it's great because at that point, by 1823, there's already river boats going up and down the Mississippi River, bringing supplies from places like St. Louis or Dubuque, Iowa, or whatever. So they're connected to trade and society in a way that they weren't when they were up in what would become Winnipeg, Manitoba. By the way, throughout the first many decades of St. Paul history, there's this constant trade back and forth between that Red River colony, the Selkirk settlement, and St. Paul. St. Paul is the sort of depot by which a lot of goods get shipped up to that Canadian settlement. And this is actually a very lucrative business for St. Paul businessmen. This is a dog sled, so they did that in the winter. In the summer, they used ox carts. So the Métis people, who are sort of mixed race folks who are living near the Selkirk settlement, end up becoming the main traders that go back and forth on this Red River Trail. And there's multiple different trails throughout the years, but it's quite an exciting ordeal when the ox cart train comes through for these early years in St. Paul, because I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit, but there'd be hundreds of these ox carts in a row, and they're full of goods, and all of the Métis traders are dressed in sort of really interesting outfits and speaking languages that most of the St. Paulites at this time don't understand. And they camp outside the city and they trade their goods for a few days, and then they turn around and go back north 450 miles to the Canadian border. So that's all whole big thing. I'm sort of getting a little bit ahead of myself because I haven't described how St. Paul comes to be yet, but it does revolve around these Canadian settlers that are living on the outskirts of Fort Snelling. And so the way that St. Paul is born is that these settlers are sort of kicked out one of the reasons for this happening is that the major who's in charge of Fort Snelling at this time is named Taliaferro, and he is just like most of the wealthy folks who are living in, or powerful folks who are coming out to the Minnesota territory to, to settle it. They're really interested in making money off land speculation. So when the 1837 treaty is signed with some of the Dakota people that would give, or I should say, where the land that was east of the Mississippi is now open for settlement by Europeans. When that treaty is signed, Taliaferro and some other people who are in charge of the fort get really excited about getting the best land claims. And so they sort of concoct this elaborate scheme with the federal government to try to expand the territory of the Fort Snelling, in order to be able to get claims on some of the best property. And this involves kicking out the Canadian refugees who had come down to live around St. Paul. So this is the journal 1839, where Taliaferro writes to the military government in the United States and asks about drawing a broader line for the boundaries of the fort. They write back, the War Department, to the major of the Fort Snelling saying, well, okay, you can remove them by military force if you have to. Please don't do it. Please exercise restraint or whatever. You can see the 19th century language that is used here. But basically, they gave them permission to evict all of the settlers around the fort. And then they drew this really broad line that extended not just around the fort boundaries, but also across the river. So you can see on this map, there's a little dot in the middle that says Rumtown. And that's near where Highland Park or Crosby Hidden Falls Park is located today. But that was one of the first places that some of the Canadian refugees settled when they were kind of moving away from Fort Snelling. And so these refugees that had come down to live by the fort end up moving a few different times. And they ended up being led by an odd person who is famous in St. Paul history, because he becomes a good foil for how St. Paulites like to define their own self after this. His name was Pierre Pig's-Eye Perrant, and probably most of you know who this is or have heard this name before, but he was a French-Canadian fur trade veteran who had spent time in Sault Ste. Marie, and he was a whiskey salesperson. He would routinely cross the boundaries into Dakota land in order to sell whiskey to Dakota people, but also would sell to any of the fort soldiers that were bored. So Minnesota in this period, especially in the winter, there wasn't a lot to do except drink whiskey. And so the major, Taliaferro, hated when his soldiers would go and drink whiskey and be unable to report for duty the next day. But this is exactly what happened. And Pierre Pig's-Eye Perrant was one of these whiskey traders that was on Taliaferro's naughty list. There is a journal where he describes Perrant a little bit. He becomes sort of famous because after the settlers get kicked out from the edges of the fort, Pierre Perrant moves to a place called Fountain Cave. This is a photograph, aerial photograph of it from 1937, when I don't think it existed anymore, but you can see where it's located. It's near the railroad bridge, about I'd say 5 miles to the east of Fort Snelling in the confluence. And so he set up shop outside this cave and started selling whiskey there also. And then eventually he ends up moving to, he loses his lease on his cave spot. He gets foreclosed on and ends up moving to where downtown St. Paul is located today. So where the lower landing was located. This was where a creek came in at the valley, sort of right near the base of those mounds, Indian Mound Cemetery Bluff. And that's where Perrant set up his shop. And he, by all accounts, was the first European settler to live in what is now downtown St. Paul. And that is why a lot of the stories of St. Paul begin with Pig's Eye, because a lot of people saw that it was a good spot to move, and as they get kicked out by the military, they end up clustering around Pierre Pig's Eye Perrant's saloon. And this is where the original name of the city comes into play. So there was a traveler in 1840 who was going up and down the Mississippi River, and basically you'd head from some camp up to the fort and back, and you'd stop on the way by Pig's Eye's saloon, where there's a couple other French Canadian people living in, on land claims that they'd made in that spot. And so one of those guys is named Brissett, and he wants to write a letter to his friend who's down on Great Cloud Island, which is about 10 miles downstream. And he didn't know how to address his letter. So he ends up, here's from his journal what he says. He says, he's at the Perrant saloon. He says, I looked up inquiringly at Perrant, and seeing his old crooked eye scowling at me, it suddenly popped into my head to date it, the letter, at Pig's Eye, feeling sure that the place would be recognized, as Perrant was well known along the river. In a little while, an answer was safely received, so he got a reply, directed to me at Pig's Eye. I told the joke to some of the boys, and they made lots of fun of Perrant. He was very mad and threatened to lick me, but never tried to execute it. So St. Paul is for a little while known as Pig's Eye, at least by the postal service, such as it was in 1840 Minnesota, which, I don't know who was delivering the mail back then, but it wasn't an official business, I don't think. But you can also see that this is sort of a joke, and it's like a joke told at a bar where you get this guy mad. Pig's Eye Perrant actually ends up sort of disappearing. He loses his lease again in 1841 and disappears into northern Wisconsin, is never heard from again. So he doesn't really have a huge, he didn't do very much. He sold whiskey, he moved cabins to pretty cool spots, and that's about it. And then he disappears and dies. I think he was sort of a miserable, he wasn't successful, he didn't get rich or anything, but his name lives on and becomes sort of an icon in St. Paul history. And indeed, there was a beer named after him not too many decades ago. And people often refer to Pig's Eye as like the before picture of what civilization was like before, Catholicism arrived. This is Pig's Eye beer. This was 1850s newspaper editor, a little poem that he wrote talking about how St. Paul had turned the corner and risen up from its original name and origin as being Pig's Eye. So the city is really born off of that. A year later, a Catholic priest, French-speaking Catholic priest, comes to St. Paul, or to Pig's Eye as it was called then. And a lot of the French Canadians that were living in St. Paul were Roman Catholic and hadn't seen a priest in many, many years. And so they really liked that this priest was there. His name was Father Galtier, and he built a chapel that he called St. Paul's Chapel. And so the city became known as St. Paul after that point, after about 1841. So I'm skipping ahead to 1852 here. You can see this is a cool old map, one of the earliest maps that I've been able to find, showing some of the land territorial claims. You can see that there's names on here where different people who had land claims, it shows their names, and so they would be selling off this property. The topography, it's really hilly downtown, so that center square there is Mears Park. It used to be called Smith Park, and there used to be a hill there that's no longer there. And then the lower landing, which was where Pig's Eye started his saloon, was sort of the center of town where all the steamboats would land and goods would be shipped on and off very quickly. Other sort of interesting parts, there was an upper landing that is now where Irvine Park is located, Chestnut Street, sort of West 7th area. And that was the other steamboat landing, a more residential one. The lower landing was industrial. And this square that's in the map here is actually a really cool spot that you can still visit today. It's one of the only sort of 19th century neighborhoods that wasn't bulldozed over the years. It's called Irvine Park, and I recommend everyone go there. The oldest house that's still in St. Paul is still standing is this one, the Charles Simmons house that dates to 1850. Here's a photo of St. Paul 1857. So right around the time that St. Paul became a state, Minnesota became a state, and St. Paul was the capital. Just you get a sense for like the Wild West vibes that St. Paul had back then. This is looking across the river to the west side. So another treaty with Dakota was signed in 1851 that opened up land settlement to the west side of the Mississippi River. And so people started building homes and taking land there too. The whole thing about treaties is too much to get into at this point, but that reference that Clarence mentioned at the beginning will probably help you. This is another photograph of St. Paul from the 1850s. This is one of the oldest buildings that's still in St. Paul. It's the Coney Island on St. Peter and 7th Place. This is another historic building that still exists called the Waldman Brewery. It's been restored. It's an 1858 brewery that now you can go visit and have a lager beer at if you want to. So let's see, I'm way behind schedule. Let's skip ahead to expansion. So the first bridge over the Mississippi River was built in St. Paul in 1859, the Wabasha Street Bridge. This is what it originally looked like. And this sort of leads to the expansion of St. Paul across the river. So originally, the west side of the river was a separate city. Oh, where did it go? Here it is, a separate city called West St. Paul. But after this bridge was built with St. Paul money, they were charging a toll for people from the west side to get back and forth. And the toll became so onerous that people on the west in West St. Paul decided that they would annex themselves into St. Paul and change counties in exchange for the toll being dropped. And St. Paul slowly grows over time in that way, annexing spaces around it, including the west side of the river. As you can see here, this is a map showing West St. Paul as it originally was a separate city. Another thing to notice in this map is Como Park is up at the top left side of the boundary, and Como Park was originally like a lake called Sandy Lake that had been in the 1850s. Sort of, there was a guy who had a little resort there, and he was marketing it as like a natural health resort where you come and you take in the fresh air and you can recover from whatever disease that ailed you or your malaise or something. But it was called Sandy Lake until the 1870s, when a park planner named Horace Cleveland Avenue is named after him. He ends up popping up and talking to St. Paul city leaders about the need for having a massive bourgeois park that would like create Victorian sort of sensibilities and public space. And so they changed the name of the lake, and the city buys this land to the west of Lake Como that you can see here. A lot of that is a golf course today, but there's also the conservatory and the rest of the Como Park that's still there. So that's pretty cool. Cleveland ends up helping design some of these parks, and also this very long parkway system that he ends up allowing St. Paul to make sure that the public access is all the way along the Mississippi River bluff, which is a great thing. So anyway, St. Paul grows quite a bit and annexes the west side. The other big thing that is on everybody's mind in St. Paul is how to get railroad connection from the city to the developed, from the new settlement to the developed cities to the east and south. So from the 1850s on, everyone in St. Paul was really scheming about this, trying to figure out how can we get a railroad. And the state legislature was heavily involved. They tried to fund many different rail connections to Dubuque, Duluth, or Chicago. But in 1857, there was a big stock market crash where all the banks went bust. And so all of these railroad schemes ended up going belly up. The first railroad to actually arrive in St. Paul was called the William Crooks. It was a locomotive, and it connected to Minneapolis. So Minneapolis was called St. Anthony back then. St. Anthony was on the east side and Minneapolis was on the west side. and eventually they combined into one city. But originally, William Crooks would go back and forth to St. Anthony. And it was quite a revolution when this railroad started running. You can see the acronym here on the back of the locomotive says St. Paul P&P PRR. So it's the St. Paul and Pacific Railroad, which is a little ambitious because it only went to Minneapolis. It did not go to the Pacific. But everybody wanted the railroad to go to the coast, to the West Coast, because that would mean St. Paul was the railroad hub that would mean economic growth for all the businesses in the city and lots of land speculation. And so that's where James J. Hill sort of enters the picture. He was a Scottish Canadian guy who arrives in St. Paul right before the 1857 crash. And I guess one of his greatest skills was he was really sharp with numbers, and he had great penmanship and attention to detail, because he started working at a warehouse and ended up rising through the ranks, eventually starting his own warehouse business. That's what's in this photo down by the lower landing, where he offloaded goods from the railroads to ships, the steamships, and back and forth, and turned that into a lucrative enterprise for himself. Here's another photo of the James J. Hill warehouse shipping complex. To make a long story short, James J. Hill ends up being a masterful. I love this photo, by the way. Look at the little carts that are in the Mississippi River there in the bottom left. But he ends up being a masterful sort of manipulator of railroad futures, and outmaneuvers a number of other people who were trying to build railroads through Minnesota to the Pacific Ocean or to Canada, or both. There was this guy named Jay Cook who was trying to build a railroad from Duluth to the Pacific. And he ended up going bankrupt, causing a huge financial panic in 1871. And that's when James J. Hill swoops in. He had been saving his money and being much more cautious, and convinces the creditors of the railroad that Cook was trying to start to sell to him and his Canadian friends, and ends up getting control of that railroad, plus building his own railroad from St. Paul to the Pacific Ocean. And that's a really short version of a long and complicated story that involves dog sleds and a bunch of other stuff. But the point is that by the time you get to the 1873 financial panic, I meant to say, by the time you get to the 1880s, James J. Hill has built two railroads, one railroad to the Pacific, the Northern Pacific Railroad. And this is a celebration that took place in downtown. This is they would erect these temporary like archway pagoda things. You can see it says St. Paul greets Japan on that one. So it's got an Orientalist theme. And once these railroads start getting completed to the Pacific coast, St. Paul really booms. So this is what Lower Town looks like. And all those buildings in the background there are date to this boom period in the 1880s when the railroads connected. A couple things about this photo, like just look at all those trains that are there and all the smoke and soot. But then also those warehouses in the background were, I guess at this point they were a couple decades old, but when they were built, they were state of the art, and St. Paul was really on the rise, and a lot of industry and commerce were coming through the city at this point. This is, by the way, what it looks like today. A lot of that Lower Town neighborhood is still there. It's one of the first historic preservation areas in the city of St. Paul. But a lot of the railroads have been removed, thankfully, because it looks kind of smoky in exchange for some parkland and the freeway. James J. Hill, once he sort of achieves his triumph, builds a massive house that you can go visit. It's owned by the Historical Society up on Summit Avenue. And St. Paul is really on the rise. So this is the St. Paul Daily Globe, 1886, showing 1853 St. Paul and then 1886 St. Paul. And what they thought would happen next would be this. St. Paul in 1919 would obviously be the next Chicago, a huge megalopolis in the middle of the Mississippi River. Well, it didn't work out that way, really. One other story that's famous in St. Paul is that in the 1880s, we always had this sort of chip on our shoulder about like feeling insecure about our place in the world, our place in America. And so we took slights very, very closely, like thin-skinned folks. There's this newspaper correspondent who comes through St. Paul in 1885 and writes a column about what he thought of the city that he had visited. And he writes that it was, quote, another Siberia unfit for human habitation. He wasn't even there in the winter. He was there in the fall. So I don't know. This guy must have been a real Lily or something. I don't know. But he, the St. Paul business community in 1885 reads this article and they start to lose their minds and end up trying to think of ways that they can like reframe this story and make it seem like St. Paul isn't a Siberia. And what they end up doing is stealing an idea from the Canadians. I've noticed that there's a lot of Canadians in this story of St. Paul here. I don't think we talk enough about our Canadian heritage here. But so Montreal had a Ice Palace Festival for a few years. In 1884, they had one where they, had people build this big palace. And the St. Paul Civic Boosters that were feeling slighted by the East Coast snobs ended up saying, okay, well, let's try that. Because funnily enough, in 1886, right when this idea was floating through the halls of the Minnesota Club in downtown St. Paul, there was a smallpox epidemic in Montreal, Canada, that meant that they had to cancel their winter carnival. So this connected business type guy in St. Paul ends up going and recruiting all the Ice Palace architects and carvers to come from Montreal down to St. Paul and build an Ice Palace here, which they do. And so the first ever, it wasn't called the Winter Carnival back then, it was called the it was called the St. Paul Athletic Winter Sports Carnival. So it had a real theme of like daring do and curling and skiing and snowballs and tobogganing, the snowshoe club. That was the vibe of it. But the Ice Palace was really what got everyone excited. And especially at the end of the, this is another idea they stole straight from the Canadians. They had groups of people shoot fireworks at the palace at the end of the carnival, and that became a huge spectacle. And that's where the Vulcans came from. All right, I've got maybe 10, 15 minutes here to get through the rest of this, which I won't be able to do. But this sort of triumph of the Winter Carnival Ice Palaces, by the way, these first few years were extremely cold. It was like 20 below during the festivals. And then it got really warm in the winter. And so after 1889, they couldn't build any more ice palaces because it was too warm. So they put it all on hold for like at least 15 years and didn't build any winter carnivals after that. But the real problem that St. Paul was facing was that Minneapolis was growing much more quickly. So there's this thing called the 1890 Census Wars. And as you can see on this chart, so the blue line is Minneapolis, the orange line is St. Paul. St. Paul had been larger, but then by 1880, Minneapolis had caught up because it had a much more booming industry of flour milling around the waterfalls there. So by the time you get to 1890, they're doing counts again. Minneapolis and St. Paul are both trying to boost their numbers so that each city can seem like the larger and more important of the Twin Cities. And so city leaders in both places like hire corrupt census takers, and they end up counting like people in the cemeteries living in the city, or putting down addresses like at the big Union Depot train station, thousands of people. They just made them up the numbers, and it ends up going to sort of a scandalous recount. The federal government steps in and says, okay, we're not going to take your numbers, we're going to send in our own auditors and recount this. And so this is newspaper ads, cartoons from the Minneapolis paper about how St. Paul was the real problem here. But really, probably in the St. Paul paper, that'd be the same kind of cartoon like this. And this is another one. What will they attempt to steal the next time? And I think that's the Metropolitan building, actually, that's in that picture that the balloon is heisting, which, if you don't know, is one of the biggest travesties, that it was demolished in 1960s in Minneapolis. So it would have been good, actually, if St. Paul had stolen the Metropolitan building, taken it over to our side of the river. Yeah, so what ends up happening is that Minneapolis grows much more quickly, at which point St. Paul has to cope with the fact that we are indeed not the most important city in the upper Midwest, or even in Minnesota, or even in the Twin Cities. that we are a second fiddle city. And it's from there that a lot of sort of the personality of St. Paul ends up emerging. I'm going to talk really quick about the streetcar and cable car system. I spent a lot of time on this in my book. The first horse cars are built in the 1870s, and then they also build cable cars. So this is a photo of Robert Street Bridge, which dates to the 18, I actually don't know that, I don't have the date in front of me. But you can see in this photo, there's a horse car. So it's a streetcar with a horse pulling it. And it was one of the first horse car lines. And the other big thing was a cable car that went up and down the big bluffs that define St. Paul to this day. This is the St. Anthony Hill, which is known today as Cathedral Hill. And you can see that this is a cable car. So there's a cable running under the ground between the tracks. And this was about a 10% grade. So it was really steep to get up this hill. I love this photo because it shows sort of how densely populated the side of the hill was. You see all these homes that aren't there today. That's what it looks like today, basically. And that's another sort of etching drawing of the St. Anthony Hill. And you can just see how thick with life it is. And if you look at that same spot today, it's really empty. About 15 years later, this hill was sort of a real pain in the butt to get up. The cable car would go really slowly and it would slow down the streetcar. And by the time they invented electric streetcars in the 1890s and got them widespread throughout the city, this cable car hill was becoming obsolete. And so they built a tunnel, the Selby streetcar tunnel that goes near where the cathedral is located today. And that ran from about 1905, about 1955, about 50 years. And here's a photo that I found from 1953, so a few years before the Selby streetcar tunnel was mothballed, that I really love this photo because it shows sort of a neighborhood that doesn't exist anymore. The Pleasant Avenue neighborhood where 35E is located today in a freeway. And it's just kind of neat. And this is what the tunnel looks like today. It's been mothballed and sealed up. So yeah, let's see. St. Paul, we build the Cathedral of St. Paul, where this old mansion had been that a fur trade guy had. Archbishop John Ireland is a famous figure in St. Paul history that was in charge of the Catholic Church in this part of Minnesota for a long time. The Minnesota State Capitol was built in the early 1900s, about 1904. 1905, it opens up, and that was the party they had. Some of the major employers in St. Paul in the early 20th century were the Great Northern Railroad. So the top three employers there are all railroads. And that makes sense because that was the big businesses. James J. Hill, both of his railroads were the number 1 and number 3 railroad, but there were other railroads as well. Swift Packing in South St. Paul is on this list. The Rapid Transit Streetcar Company, a bunch of other ones. Gordon Ferguson was a fur company. But also what wasn't on there was the breweries. So there's a bunch of big famous breweries in St. Paul history. The Schmidt Brewery, this is their bowling team out on an excursion. The Hams Brewery on the east side. So both of those employed hundreds of people in the city as well. There's another outing group at the Hams Brewery, the Tuxedo Club. I don't actually see any tuxedos in the picture, so I don't know what that's about. There was a famous strike that James J. Hill handled where Eugene Debs arrives. That's in my book. I talk a bit about it. Basically, Debs was trying to organize the Great Northern Railroad and get every one of the workers under the same union, the IWW. And he and James J. Hill did not get along. They sort of meet in Hill's warehouse and his headquarters, and they sort of agree to disagree, and then ends up getting arbitrated by the Minneapolis Chamber of Commerce, who decides sort of splits it down the middle. And the strike lasted for weeks and was a big, difficult problem for James J. Hill. And he decides he doesn't want to deal with strikes anymore, so he becomes sort of more amenable to labor demands after that point. And that sort of sets the tone for St. Paul's labor history, where there's sort of a more collegial attitude between business and labor than there was in Minneapolis, where they were very anti-union. And this sort of comes to a head around the Twin Cities Streetcar Company, which was run by Minneapolis businessman named Thomas Lowry. and his son Horace Lowry, they had built a large streetcar facility at the corner of Snelling and University in the early 1900s. So this was a big factory where all the streetcars were built and maintained. They employed hundreds of workers, but they were not a union shop. And most places in St. Paul were union shops. So this really pissed off a lot of the labor leaders in St. Paul. And this comes to a head in 1917 when there's a big strike. So they were trying to organize the streetcar shop, and the streetcar operators and riders end up having this big ordeal, violence, people are beat up. There's campaigns to support the streetcar operators or not support the streetcar union. And it ends up becoming sort of violent where there's a riot downtown St. Paul in October. The streetcar workers end up smashing a bunch of the streetcars that are owned by Horace Lowry, the owner of the Rapid Transit Company. Funnily enough, they didn't smash anything else. The rioters were very careful about just destroying the property of the Rapid Transit Company and not any of the other property owners in downtown St. Paul, which is maybe one reason why the police chief at the time, a man named John O'Connor, didn't really intervene. He was on the side of the unions during this strike. And he's like, well, I guess these Minneapolis businessmen get what they deserve. And so they kind of let this demonstration just happen on its own. And this coincides with World War I. So this is where I'll leave this story, because I think 1917 is sort of a pivotal year where things shift quite a bit in Minnesota and in America around a bunch of key issues. But unfortunately for the strikers who were trying to unionize the streetcar company, this happened during World War I when a special committee had been given almost dictatorial power over Minnesota policing and also censorship. It was called the Commission on Public Safety, and there were some well-known businessmen and the governor on this commission, and they, because we'd entered World War I, the idea was that, well, we need to tamp down on any dissent and all be in it together. So, you know, this is a common thing that happens during wartime. And the Commission on Public Safety sort of used their power to crack down on the strikers that are trying to organize the streetcar company. And they even deputize people from Fort Snelling to come into St. Paul and quell the riot and the people that are demonstrating against the streetcar bosses. Okay, let's see, it's 8 o'clock, and I promised that would be about where I would stop it.
Thank you, Bill. That was a lot of history to cover. So we so appreciate your overview. And again, check out Subtext Books to get Bill's book, which is really fantastic. There's a couple comments. Let me just go back. First of all, there was a comment that in 1766 to 67, Carver explored parts of present-day Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Iowa. So that's that date. Thank you, Violet, for that. And then Barbara mentioned that the architect and park designer Cleveland also designed Oakland Cemetery. There was a question from Judy about St. Anthony Park. The oldest houses in that neighborhood are from the 1870s, possibly. Do you know if St. Anthony Park was a suburb, or when did it become part of St. Paul? Oh, you're muted, Bill.
That's such a great question. The longer version of my little blab here, I talk about the early railroad suburbs. That I skipped over it for purposes here. But yeah, St. Anthony Park and Miriam Park and Union Park were all separate suburban cities that grew up around stops on the railroads that were built in the 1870s and 1880s between St. Paul and Minneapolis, when they were surrounded by, like, I don't know, prairie. So yeah, they're very cool historic spots. Sort of the interesting thing about them too is that both of those originally bourgeois suburbs end up like getting surrounded by industrial land, because they are also right next to these railroad lines that become like places where you put factories. And so there's, even to this day, this, I think, really fascinating mix of, Victorian residential neighborhoods with curving parks and roads. And then right next door, there'll be a factory with a smokestack. And that's how it was for a long time. And so, yeah, St. Anthony Park is a really amazing historic part of the city, but what year it got annexed, I'm not exactly sure. I think it would probably be in the 1880s.
Clarence mentioned, oh no, before we get there, Barbara would like to see your map of the expanding city limits again from the 19th century.
Sure. It's not my favorite map. I haven't found a really good one, but there you go. The Ramsey County Highway Department put this together.
I haven't seen that one until you showed it. That's a really great map.
Yeah, but it doesn't show the western side. So this
No.
is city limits 1875 or so, and then it moves to the west also.
So a small plug for the Ramsey County Historical Society Research Center is we do have the plat maps going back if you want to check out your house. And we also have city directories and stuff like that. So if you're interested in some of this and checking out your neighborhood or your house, we've got stuff down in our research center, which is back open now in the Landmark Center. Clarence says, doesn't St. Paul have a much different history because John Ireland helped develop the city with workers living near and going to church with the captains of industry, while in Minneapolis, the wealthy were much more removed from their workers?
Yeah, that's a great comment. I think the book that I recommend on this is Mary Lethbridge Wingard's Claiming the City. She talks a lot about the role the Catholic Church played in sort of bringing workers and the business community sort of in conversation so that they could figure out their differences without having the incredible animosity that existed over in Minneapolis. But I think there's other issues as well, which are that like Minneapolis had a different kind of workforce. So it was more concentrated industrial jobs where you have thousands of people working in maybe less skilled labor conditions in centralized spots. And so those mills really, there was less desire to have a skilled, there was less need to have a skilled workforce. And St. Paul operations were sort of smaller shops, a lot of small enterprises where you'd have a different sort of labor setup. And the other thing is that St. Paul wasn't as wealthy. So people here were more, less able to get their way. And there were attempts to like get rid of unions in St. Paul. The one that I talk about in my book is by a guy named Charles Ames, who was the president of the West Publishing Company. And he tried to start a similar Citizens League type group to the one in Minneapolis. And it didn't work. The labor organizers were too strong. And also there just wasn't enough of a business community with enough resources to push that agenda very well. In Minneapolis, they had a much more tightly knit and powerful sort of linkage between the police, the business booster class, people that own the mills, the streetcar operators. So that led to the sort of much more anti-union history over there. There was a question about the dog sled picture.
Yeah, the dog sled picture Deborah wanted to know, is the house on the hill with the cupola the Burbank Livingston Griggs house?
Yeah, good question. I'll have to find its early photo, I think. There it is. Yeah, might be. I don't know. I wonder where this is actually. 7th and Walnut. Huh.
So we're not sure which direction that's
It must be looking up the Summit Hill area.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. That's a really early photograph. Probably there aren't any homes left from that period that are in the photograph.
Just so that everybody knows, Clarence put the link in for Mary Lethert Wingard's book in the chat, so you can take a look at that. And then Joe had a question: what determined the present boundaries between St. Paul and Minneapolis? Was there ever any competition to annex the former railway suburbs on the western side of St. Paul?
Yeah, good question. I don't know. Like, I don't know. So I'd have to read my St. Anthony book. There's a Dave Lanegren wrote a good history of St. Anthony Park, because that's sort of the northwest spot right there. And I would have to look back at that book.
Okay, any other questions right now? Comments? Okay, well, we're waiting for those. Thanks, Bill, for this great presentation. Just want to remind everybody, Bill will be back in January. Oh, no, there's one more coming up. And that will be up on our website soon. And then Tim wanted to know, by whose authority were restrictive covenants established to prohibit land purchased by Blacks and others? Was there broad consensus in the government, business, et cetera, about the appropriateness of this?
That's a great question from Tim. And the reason that I think 1917 is an interesting year to think about a big change is because that's when those restrictive covenants start to appear. There seems to be like a big shift in sort of anxiety about race that happens around the time of World War I, where land developers, so the restrictive covenants were put in place by real estate developers for the most part, as a way to boost the value of your property. So if you're developing land in, Mac Groveland or whatever, you can sell your homes for more if you promised everyone that it'll only be white people living there. It's a really terrible part of American history, but that's why they were put in place. And I haven't ever read anything about pushing back against that. I think it was just like, if you can make money doing it, then it was fine. There were definitely, people of color that were trying to live in those neighborhoods. And the famous, I talk about a famous case in the Mac Groveland neighborhood in my book. Nellie Francis moved into the Mac Groveland area, and I forget what year that was, but it was probably in the 1920s or something. I'd have to look it up, but yeah, there were definitely people who didn't like these rules and tried to stop them. But I don't know. I haven't seen historical documentation of like city caring about it, or any government agencies or anyone. Maybe the NAACP when they arrive. Certainly by the time you get to the 40s, when there's a court case and those rules are thrown out. But early on, yeah.
I just want to remind everybody on that. Yes, thank you, Clarence. There's a project called Mapping Prejudice at the university that covers Minneapolis. And then there's one, and I just put the link also in the chat, for Welcoming the Dear Neighbor, which is the St. Paul version. And we had speakers in a panel talk about that, and they will hopefully be back again next summer after their project closes up. So if you're interested in that issue, we will be presenting those as well. So any other comments or questions? Okay, thank you, Bill. Thank you, everybody. I'm going to stop the recording. I want to remind everybody to come back for another program, and we'll hope to see you soon. And thank you, Clarence, and thank you, Judy, Eastside Freedom Library, as well as the Roseville Library. So if you'd like to stay on for a few minutes and chat, we'll be happy to do that. So